so nice to see all your wonderful faces today.
Nice group.
I was really struggling with okay, so I have to come up with a study. What am I going to say? What are we supposed to be studying? What are we doing, Art? What do you want us to do? I thought maybe I would just do like a little survey and just spend the time planning for the year. And I thought, well, Tu B'Shvat's coming up, so maybe I'll start just to read about Tu B'Shvat, see what comes up. The Lord is so faithful. Because I started to see, bing, 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 all these different things starting to come that really fit with our current series, which is the study of Avodah or service. And I'd had it in the back of my mind for a long time to start, as part of that, looking at Kashrut, which is, I kind of know, I don't know about you guys, but I always feel like that's kind of a sensitive subject in the Messianic community, because everybody has their different ideas about how to observe the dietary laws and which one should we observe, and was what the rabbis say, is that important? And we all, in the Messianic movement, there's people come down on so many places. You can go for a Jews for Jesus event and have treif sometimes. That's not Lashon Hara, that's public knowledge. Okay, so there's some Messianic congregations who believe that everything, kind of like the Christian theology, everything's underneath, the blood, and so, we don't have to do that anymore. And I know that's not what we believe, but there might be some other, differences of opinion here too. But I was thinking that this was really good timing to start out talking about eating. Now, how many of you overate during the holidays?
I had overate during the
holidays. I didn't.
I went through most of the holidays. I didn't gain any weight until the last weekend after I went back to work, and for some reason I gained 3 pounds, like that. It was crazy. So we struggle. Usually January is the time we begin new diets, right? We start off good New Year's resolution. My manicurist, she's funny. She teaches a spin class, and at 5 o'clock in the morning. Who would get up and work that hard at 5 o'clock in the morning? I don't know, but anyway, evidently a lot of people do in her class. And they always get so annoyed because right after January, the first spin class, the place is packed out. And all the regulars have to come early in order to get a bike. And they're always so annoyed. And she says it takes about 2 weeks. And then they're back to the regular crowd and they're fine.
Same people.
Isn't it? So that's often what happens with our New Year's resolutions. But it just so happens that Tu B'Shvat has this amazing connection with eating. And I think it's a really good introduction to talking about Kashrut. Are you okay with tackling Kashrut in the next few months? It'll probably take a few months to get through some stuff. And I'm also going to be talking about some Kabbalah today. Is that too radical?
No.
I'm going to be talking a little bit about some ideas from Kabbalah that the ancient sages believed about Tu B'Shvat. So we're going to come back to this quote: "The fruit of the righteousness is a tree of life, and whoever captures souls is wise." Proverbs 11:30. It is a tree of life to those who take hold of it, and whoever grasps it close will be made happy. Do you remember when Bob used to talk about the parallelism of or duality of Hebrew sayings, right? Mm-hmm. So if you look at the first sentence, because we would be wondering, well, what is the it that is a tree of life? Okay, but if we look at the in the second sentence, but if you look at this, the first quote, the fruit of righteousness is a tree of life, and whoever captures souls is wise. Okay, so what we do is we take the first object, the fruit of the righteous, is equivalent to whoever captures souls. So the fruit of righteousness is we're supposed to be capturing souls. Those are equivalent. And then we see that the tree of life is equivalent to what? Wisdom. So the sages teach that Chachmat HaTorah, the wisdom of Torah, is likened to a tree of life. And you see that throughout Scripture. Okay, so wherever you see tree of life, you can say equals Torah wisdom. Okay? So with that as a background, we're going to come back around to it at the end of time. You guys remember what Tu B'Shvat's all about? Trees, right. So hence the theme of the tree of life, right? And we're going to keep coming back to that theme again and again. I just thought this is funny, thinking, I've probably said it before, but Jackie Mason said that Judaism is a culinary religion. Every Jewish holiday can be summed up like this. They tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat. And food is definitely part of, God even gives so many commandments about food. Even the festivals. He says, and you shall have a festival and you shall eat meat. He tells us what to eat. He tells us what not to eat. He tells us at Passover there's certain things that we eat, we don't eat. And we know that there's certain things that we eat because they have such significance. So this theme about food and Judaism is like huge. It is a very Jewish principle that eating and the appropriate pleasure of eating is a spiritual act that is part of our avodah or service or devotion to God. That's what jumped out at me yesterday. Because here I was reading about Tu B'Shvat, and I came up with these passages I'm going to share with you from these writers, and then I went, oh, eating is part of our service to God. It's part of our avodah or devotion. So I thought, that's when I went and said, okay, God, I know this is what I'm supposed to talk about. So David Aaron, in this little article on Chabad.org, and I only pulled from about 3 resources this time, but said so what we're looking at is pleasure, okay? And the pleasure of eating. Real pleasure is experiencing a connection. Oh, by the way, how many people like to eat? Yes, we like to eat, right? That's a given, right? Especially during the holidays. Isn't that what makes the holiday special? Mm-hmm. Isn't that what makes the festival special? Isn't that what makes Oneg special?
Yes.
You know? Food, yes, it's a pleasure. It's not just like, oh, we have to nurture our bodies, so we don't die. God gave us our taste buds and our noses to have incredible pleasure with the food that we eat, right? All the way back, as we're going to see, back to the Garden of Eden. It was the first commandment that he gave us. The first commandment he gave us ever was to eat of the fruit of the garden. Okay? So it's a mitzvah. It's a commandment. Real pleasure is experiencing a connection with God. We enjoy the ultimate spiritual pleasure when we enjoy the physical pleasures of this world as part of our divine service, avodah. Then the act of receiving and enjoying God's gifts to us is amazingly transformed into a selfless act of serving God. Did you know that when you like powering down your smoothie? That could be an act of devotion to God? You have your latte. I've given up lattes. I'm doing Dandy Blend now with pumpkin spice. It's pretty good, huh? And but you're having your latte, your coffee. That can be an act of selfless devotion to God. Who knew? So how is this so? The Torah teaches that God created the world so that we could experience goodness in general and His goodness in particular. Experiencing His goodness, bonding with God, is the greatest joy imaginable. God empowers us to bond with Him by serving His purpose for creation. Just as when we do for others, we feel connected to them, so too serving God enables us to bond with Him. Ironically, serving God is actually self-serving, profoundly fulfilling and pleasurable. If we eat and enjoy the fruits of this world for God's sake, because this is what He asks of us, then we are actually serving God and bonding with Him. We serve God by acknowledging that the fruits of this world are His gifts to us, and by willfully accepting and enjoying those gifts. The root of the Jewish life is in fact enjoyment, the pleasure of connecting to God. We connect to God by serving Him, and this means obeying His command to enjoy the fruits of the world, which started in the Garden of Eden, as we shall see in a minute. So it's interesting that there's two words for to eat in Hebrew. The first is akilah, to eat. The second is le'etah. Le'etah is different. It means to eat in a glutinous fashion. It's much more than simply taking in food, but it's a lust to devour or consume. So when we read, for example, when Esau says, I'm hungry, give me the stew, the way that it actually translated is, shove it in my mouth, right? And he gave up what? He gave up his inheritance because he wanted that stew so bad. The word is le'etah. That's the word that is used in Scripture to talk about that eating. So the sages talk about that it's more than just eating food, that desire, that hunger. We can have a hunger for material wealth, for honor seeking, for addiction to power, praise, drugs, caffeine, attention. Okay, there's le'etah, an eating where we want to consume. But this is not the kind of eating that gives honor to God. Sitting down at a table and stuffing your face gives no honor to God. And that's not eating in consistency with the way he gave the gift. Right? Does that make sense? So when we grab pleasure from the world and get so distracted by the consumption of the gift that we forget about the giver. That is le'etah. Interesting? Yes. Okay. It is associated with the word gluttony. You know, gluttony is a sin. It's even mentioned in the Brit HaHadashah. Gluttony is a sin. And it's not just about overeating. It's the process by which we eat. It's the motivation behind which we eat. That makes sense? Mm-hmm. So we talk about drug addictions, food addictions, anything that we're addicted to, we have to have. We feel like we have to have, or we can't be okay if we don't have it. That's the way I would psychologically translate that. That makes sense? Yes. So the Talmud teaches that a tzaddik, a righteous person, is someone who has rectified their eating. They have transformed their eating, or raised what would be an act of le'etah to an act of avodah. Now, isn't that interesting? I thought that was so cool. Mitchell was talking at lunch about how we went to Shiloh Steakhouse for our anniversary. And, he was talking about all the great food. And it's a kosher steakhouse in LA that an acquaintance of his through Chabad owns. So, and it was wonderful food. But you know what was really cool about that meal in a kosher restaurant? Is there was 3 washing stations. They were truly amazing. And as some of you may know, there's a tradition that when we wash our hands before eating any meal with bread, right? That we don't talk between the washing of the hands and the partaking of the bread. And that's because washing our hands is considered to be of one thing with the blessing that we say over the bread. So we don't interrupt between washing our hands and blessing the bread. And if you guys remember, maybe from way, 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 way back when we were talking about Shabbat and we were talking about challah, the bread represents all of God's provision to us, His abundance to us, right? And it is also symbolic of the showbread that was in the temple, which is why we have 2 on the table. And it's just, at least on a Rev Shabbat, it's symbolic of all these things. And we wash our hands because the priests in the temple would wash before they brought their sacrifices to God. So even at the beginning of a meal, it is an Orthodox custom, if you're going to have bread, that you wash your hands just as if you were a priest. And you say the blessing, and then you're not supposed to talk. Well, we know what's cool in the restaurant? At one of the washing stations, they have a whole basket of little bread chunks, just like what we have for oneg, right next to the sink. So you could wash your hands, say the blessing over the bread, have a little bread, and go back to the table and talk to your dinner companions, whether they were ready to have bread or not. Isn't that cool?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
But it was so cool because, okay, the meat was kosher, and we'll talk about that in a future time, why that's important, but and the restaurant was beautiful, but everything there was dedicated to thanking the Creator for what was in front of us. It was so cool. I have a little, I took pictures of the washing stations because I thought they were so cool. And of course, it was nicely decorated and all that kind of stuff. And what's interesting is they have these, because of the way the sinks were made, they put river rocks in the sink. So this, you know, what's how sometimes you turn on a sink, and if the bowl is really polished, and it just like pops right out and splashes you. So they had these river rocks in there, so that it would just splash through the pebbles and not splash all over you.
So cool.
I thought that this is like really
It's very class.
So feel free to see. Wait a second. No, we don't need that one. You can just flip through them. They're so pretty. The first one you'll see the bread next to it, and then the second one in the back is just so pretty. But anyway, you can just flip it that way.
Wow.
So this is the idea that we take something that seems very mundane, very ordinary, and every physical pleasure in the world we lift, and it becomes a spiritual act in that enjoyment. Don't we have a cool God?
Yes.
I always used to tell the kids in Shabbat class that we have the only God who tells us we're not allowed to work, we have to have a party and enjoy good food. What gods are there that tell you have to? It's a commandment. You know, it's pretty cool. So let's look at Tu B'Shvat. Tu B'Shvat is the New Year for trees, or Rosh Hashanah, Le'ilanot, the New Year for trees. 2 is 15. I found out for the first time, it's 9 plus 6. It is Tet plus Vav, 2. Okay, Tet and a Vav, 2, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, can you think about why it might not be Yad plus Hey, which also equals 15? Yad Hey.
Yeah, well, right there you said.
Yad Hey. Yeah, it's the name Yah. It's one of the names of God.
Yes.
So we don't use the name of God for a mundane purpose. So in the Hebrew counting system, 2 for 15 is 9 plus 6, not 10 plus 5. It's written as Tet plus Vav, so that we don't write the name of God in a place where it doesn't belong. Isn't that cool?
Yes.
All right. So Tu B'Shvat is the 15th of Shavat. It's a biblical observance, and I'm going to qualify that in a minute. It's a tradition in Judaism. It is National Arbor Day in Israel, and it's also a mystic Seder. So, you know, besides the Jewish culture being all about eating, it's also about the growing of the food. Jewish culture is agricultural, and you guys probably already know, many of the festivals are organized around the harvest and around the sowing and all of that. So over and over and over, Torah addresses the land and its cultivation repeatedly. So the rabbis talk about that there's actually a Torah for trees. If you go through the Torah, there's all of these, and we don't have time today to go into it, but look up Torah for trees or look up Tu B'Shvat. There's all these different verses in Scripture that talk about how we are supposed to treat the trees. So Sid mentioned, for example, today, that when you go in and into war, you never cut down a fruit tree as a battering ram. That's in the Torah. We preserve the fruit, we preserve the food, and we're not to use that for other purposes. We preserve the trees. So there's all these scriptures about Torah, and one of them is very important, and it's the reason for Tu B'Shvat. It's in Leviticus 19, and I'll just read it to you. It's not on there, but I'll read it to you. It says, "When you enter the land and plant any tree for food, you shall regard its fruit as uncircumcised, or la." In other words, you're not going to pick it for 3 years. Did you know that there was all these agricultural rules in Torah? There's incredible details. You are not to take the fruit of the tree for 3 years. And then in the 4th year, all of its fruit shall be holy, an offering of praise to the Lord. In other words, it's a tithing to the temple. Only in the 5th year may you use its fruit to increase its yield for you. So they had to wait three years of its fruit bearing. They didn't touch it. They just let it fall. The 4th year, that goes to the temple.
Right.
And the 5th year, you get to start using it for yourself. So the first fruits, the whole first year of that fruit tree is given to the temple. Well, here's a question. When does the year start? When does the year start? Maybe, but trees are not always planted on exactly the same day, right? So it kind of be hard to keep track of, but okay. So how do we know when the year starts, the new year for trees starts? We don't know how to calculate that, right? So Tu B'Shvat is not in the Bible, but it is in the Bible because it's right there that we understand that the rabbis needed to figure out, how do we figure out which fruit you leave on the ground and which fruit you start to pluck and give to the temple? What year is the 4th year? So they had to determine a new year for trees, a day upon which they would count. So if you planted your tree sometime before that date, right, that's the 1st year, and then you come down to that date again, that's the 2nd year. You come down to that date, that's the 3rd year. So any fruit after that time in the 4th year would now go to the temple. You count a year, and now you can start harvesting the fruit for yourself. So what they did is they picked a day which is Israel's springtime. It's the day when the ground, and they do get some snow. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but Jerusalem's gotten a whole lot of snow this year. Crazy snow. Okay, so it's the time when the ground starts to thaw, and the trees start to thaw, and they start to bring up the water, and so the sap is running up into the tree. And it also is the time when the almond trees set out their first blooms. So Tu B'Shvat, if you right now coming up in Israel, if you went to Israel, and you'll probably start seeing them on the internet if you subscribe to any of these. I have these great Facebook pages that show me pictures from Israel. You'll see all these almond trees in bloom.
They're the first to bloom.
They are the first to bloom, yes. Mm-hmm. So that is how they came about, the 15th of Shabbat. That generally speaking, by the 15th of Shabbat, the almond trees were in bloom, the trees were starting to pick up the sap, and so that became the new year for trees. So it's in the Bible, but it's not in the Bible. It's where? It's in the Talmud, because the rabbis had to figure out how to count the years. Okay? So it arose because of the necessity of determining when the years started and calculating the tithes. Thus, this is the date when the temple taxes were assessed to the farmers, Ma'aser. And as I said, it's based on the signs of spring. So traditional halakha, so after the second temple was destroyed, you couldn't harvest the fruit and send it to the temple, could you? So it became a tradition that you would eat the 7 species listed in Torah that occur in the land of Israel. So you would have some wheat, some barley, some grapes, some figs, some pomegranates, some olives, and dates. So symbolically, you were reaping the first fruits of the trees. They were supposed to go to the temple, but we don't have a temple. So you would eat some of those fruits to commemorate the day. They also ate almonds to recall the bloom of the almond trees. And that always makes me feel almost sad when I think about that. How the beauty in Israel, the almond trees, and you think about all these Jews that are kicked out. They're no longer in their land. But they remember the almond trees by eating an almond. Because obviously the almonds aren't coming, that's later in the year, right? But the eating of the almonds is to remember the almond tree, that beautiful picture of the almonds in bloom. And they also used to eat carob. Yeah, that chocolate substitute, commonly used while traveling to Jerusalem during the temple days. So they were also remembering, this is when we used to go up to the temple to give our taxes, to give our first fruits of the trees, and we would bring along this carob because it didn't spoil on the journey. And so they would eat carob and remember that they used to go up to the temple to bring these fruits. Isn't that neat? And of course, they're said with the appropriate blessings for each fruit. Now, you may have heard me say it before, and I will say it again, that Yeshua was a Pharisee. How do we know he was a Pharisee? Because he blessed his food before he ate it. Why is that different? Why is that different than what it says in the Bible? What does it say in the Bible that we're supposed to bless our food?
After meals.
After meals. That's right, in Deuteronomy. And when you have come into the land, and you have eaten and have been satisfied, then you will bless the Lord your Creator who gave you the food. So it's commanded in Deuteronomy that we bless the food afterwards. That's what grace after the meals is all about in Judaism. Okay? Which they say every time, after every meal. It's my favorite prayer. We'll look at it later. But Yeshua blessed the bread before he had the meal. Well, he didn't bless the bread. He blessed the Creator. We're going to talk about the difference. He blessed God when he broke the bread. That was a Pharisaic custom. The blessing of eating each of these fruits and saying a different blessing over each fruit is a Pharisaic custom. It is now an Orthodox custom because they're the inheritance of the Pharisees, right? So when the temple was destroyed, there's no more Sadducees. You only got the Pharisees left, right? So when they ate these fruits, they had blessings over the fruit. So we're going to look at that a little bit closer probably in a future time. But, and I actually meant to bring the blessings today. I'm sorry. But we'll have that for you next time. There's different blessings you say over different categories of food. It's okay. There isn't a different blessing for lemons versus grapes. There's a blessing over the fruit of the tree. There's a blessing over the fruit of the earth. There's a blessing over the fruit of the vine. Everybody knows that one. Borei Pri Hagafen, and we say it every Shabbat, right, before we have the wine. We say there's a blessing over bread. And my favorite is the blessing that goes, who creates all, because if you run out of those categories, there's a blessing for everything else. Remember in Fiddler on the Roof, there's a blessing for there's a blessing for everything. Is there a blessing for the Tsar? Yes, and he thinks, may the Lord bless and keep the Tsar far away from us. Well, that's what they were making a joke about, that there's a blessing over everything. So this last category is, bless the Creator who brings all things forth by his word. Isn't that a wonderful blessing? Yes. Who brings all things forth by the power of his word.
So would you bless food before and after?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, what it's traditional to do is if you're going to have a big meal where there is some bread, you just bless the bread and you eat it first, and that covers the whole meal. Because remember, we said that bread is a symbol of all of God's sustenance for us. If you don't have a blessing, a meal with bread, then you can make one of the other blessings, like who creates all things through his word.
But then you said it's commanded to bless after.
Yes, and that's called grace after the meals, and that's a little bit longer.
Do you have it in here?
Yes, it is. It's on page 222, but it's very abbreviated. The Orthodox one, if you say it fast, takes about 5 minutes. But if they have a meal, and of course the rabbis have to say, well, what's a meal versus a snack? You don't have to say grace after meals if you're only having a snack, but what's a snack versus a meal? Now you understand why we have Talmud. Because what if everybody had a different idea about what was a snack versus a meal? So some would pray and some wouldn't pray, and then they would argue about it, and then they have a war, and it would be ugly. So the rabbis had to say, well, a certain amount of food is a snack, and if you go over that, it's really a meal. And so after a meal, you say grace after the meals, because God commanded to say a prayer after the meals. But he didn't say it to say it after a snack. So you can say like a little blessing before the snack, but you don't have to do grace after the meals. But if you're going to have a meal and you're having bread, then you say the blessing for the bread, and then you don't have to say anything else, and they have the grace after the meals. You got it? But what is the purpose of all these details? What is the purpose?
Thank God.
To what?
To thank God.
To thank God. Why?
Because he provides.
Provides, but what are we doing? We're raising the physical act of eating to a spiritual act that is obeying a commandment of God. That's the reason. That's one of the ways. The blessings is one of the ways that we raise this physical act, this just consumption, and we raise it to a spiritual act of service to God. Isn't that kind of cool? But you didn't know that when we said grace, right?
No.
Okay.
So Trina,
Mm-hmm.
so when you bless the food, because we're so used to blessing the food first before we eat.
Yes.
Yeshua used to do that.
Yes, because he was a Pharisee.
Okay, but then now we're supposed to bless the food after we eat.
Both.
Both. And by whose authority is it? The same authority?
God's authority, because in Deuteronomy he said, and when you come into the land and you have eaten and you have been satisfied, then you will bless the Lord your Creator who gave it to you.
Okay.
So that's by God's authority.
Deuteronomy 8:10.
Deuteronomy 8:10. Thank you. It's my teaching assistant. Okay. So another thing that we do on Tu B'Shvat is that we often the men will stay up in the night, and because it starts at night, right? And they will read the fruit of goodly trees. It's called Prei Etz Hadar, which are selections from the Torah, the Talmud, and the Zohar, which is part of Kabbalah, regarding trees, fruit, fruitfulness, and so on. In other words, they're going to read all the passages on Tuesday night about trees and fruit, and talk about all the spiritual symbolism of all those things. Okay. So Israeli Arbor Day came about after the establishment of Israel, because now in the times of the Bible, it was a goodly land. Remember, they went in and they said, it's fruitful and it's goodly and it's amazing. And what did the settlers find in 1948? Desolation, desert, wasteland. Because when the Jewish people left the land started to die. The Jewish people came back to the land, and now Israel is flourishing and flowering, right? But one of the reasons is because they have purposely replanted, and so they started replanting trees. And so because Tu B'Shvat is the new year for trees, it started to become accustomed to plant trees on Tu B'Shvat. And that's what Sid was talking about today, about planting a tree on Tu B'Shvat. And so so in Israel, they will have special ceremonies called Netiat Etzim, planting of tree ceremonies. Or if you're in the diaspora, the Jewish community will collect money and give it to the Jewish National Fund to plant the trees. That's what he was talking about.
Now, on the days that you plant the trees, is there a full moon by any chance on that day?
Yes, there would be, because it would be the 15th, wouldn't it?
Because my grandmother had mentioned to me, without even knowing anything that has related to Torah, but that on a full moon, you're supposed to plant a tree.
Really?
It gives fruit.
How
And she
interesting.
plants like a lot of fruit trees. So I was just telling Mom that I'm gonna go see her today probably. So
Yeah.
I'm gonna bring her like a piece of a pomegranate tree. to
Yes.
plant.
Oh, that's so cool.
So she did
And what's your mom's background?
My grandma?
I mean, your grandma's background. Yeah.
She's Mexican.
Yeah. So, okay. So I'm going to repeat it just in case it wasn't heard here. But so your grandmother was taught you plant a fruit tree, especially, but trees
On a full moon.
on a full
And she
moon.
said exactly on a year from that date you will get bloom of fruit.
And a year later you'll get bloom. How
Yes.
interesting.
She said if you don't do it on the full moon, it could take years for you to get fruit.
Interesting. So we have this whole folklore,
Yeah.
yeah, that is very consistent. Yeah. Kind of wonder who's back in there in your ancestry, right? So, or there may be something about the power of the moon at that time of year. Who knows? That God put into the universe, right? So, it's also traditional to talk about. So Deuteronomy 20:19 says that human life is like a tree in the field, and so it has also become customary, even in secular Israeli circles or Reform Jewish circles. They might not be doing the whole thing. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't know if this is the time to ask it, but since she was talking about planting a tree, does planting a tree in a pot count? Like, it's not in the ground, but like in a container.
I don't see why planting in a container wouldn't
This
count.
would apply even.
Yeah, no, the point is that we're participating with God in the creation in the world. And that's what I was going to say. So on Tu B'Shvat in Israel, because it says human life is like a tree in the field, it becomes a time to assess man's place in creation. Like, what are we doing in creation? Are we taking care of creation? Adam was given the charge that we were supposed to take care of the world. How are we doing that? It's sort of like the annual, state of the nation kind of assessment. How are we doing in taking care of our world? And so it has become, even in secular circles in Israel, kind of a day to discuss environmental concerns, to discuss in spiritual circles we talk about tikkun olam, which is repairing the world. Our mission that we are to help repair the world after the fall in the garden. And sin entered the world and the world started to die. We are here to try and help repair that. And we're going to see in a minute how that's so essential to a mystic understanding of Tu B'Shvat. So then also alleviating the suffering of living creatures, which is called Sa'ar Ba'elim Karim. Love for the land of Israel, Ahavat Israel. The principle of do not destroy, Bal Tashchid. Ecological issues, all those kinds of things. You'll see all sorts of articles coming out on the internet, and that would be the subject of discussion in Israel next week.
And you want to hear a cool fact? In Israel, it's the only place in the world where there's actually more trees that are there now, after the land has been inhabited, than there was, whenever they first got there.
Wow.
Yeah. Everywhere else, it's like they cut them down.
The tree.
Yeah.
So the tree population is dwindling as the human population goes up. But in Israel, as the human population goes up, the tree population is going up. That's interesting.
But I think they purposely do that.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, yeah.
Because these principles of caring for the land and repairing the land are embedded in Torah. Right? So whether the Israelis in the land are observant or not observant, they still understand these Torah principles, and they're dedicated to these principles, and the land is flowering. That's kind of cool. Okay, so let's talk just a little bit about what is this mystical element, this Kabbalah thing. Now you guys know what Kabbalah is?
Jewish mysticism.
Jewish mysticism, yeah. So, in about the 16th century, now remember, we're still kicked out of Jerusalem, right? 16th century, so in Safed, outside of Jerusalem, became a center for Jewish learning and Jewish mysticism, and there were many rabbis that gathered there and studied there, and they started to write down some of the mystical ideas that actually were a little bit earlier, from the 10th and 11th centuries, that had been passed down. They started writing down the Kabbalah, we now know to be the Kabbalah, which is really a collection of works. So just as the Talmud is a collection of writings, right? When we say Kabbalah, we're really talking about a collection of writings, one of the most important, and the first one, which was the Zohar. So these were stories. They were visions that rabbis had. They were interpretations of Scripture. Think of it as another level of commentary. When we look at the levels of interpretation of Scripture, remember what the highest one is? It's the mystical element, right? So Peshat is the plain meaning, and then we have, help me out here, the drash, and then the remez, the drash, which is like the interpretation, the remez, which is the hint, and then the sud, which is the mystical element. So this is sud. So what I'm talking to you about is sud, okay? You're not going to see any peshat in what I'm about to tell you. Are we okay with that? Okay. So it's a way of thinking about Scripture at maybe a deeper level, or a higher level. I guess technically it would be the higher level, closer to God. So to sum it up, the idea is that just through the simple act of eating fruit, the 7 species, during the Tu B'Shvat festive dinner, we are able to contribute to the cosmic repair, or tikkun, of Adam and Eve's transgression. Isn't that interesting? Now, obviously, as a believer, I would say that Yeshua is ultimately the one who repairs original sin for us. But isn't this interesting that within Judaism we have this theme of that we have to deal with what happened in the garden. We have to deal with that. So the mystics of Safed saw Tu B'Shvat as a time to repair the original sin of eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden. And they actually developed a whole Seder, just like the Passover Seder. And I think last year I brought the fruit and we kind of did the blessings and ate from the 7 species and so forth. But there's actually a Seder that you can sit down. They also have family ones you can do with kids, a little Haggadah for Tu B'Shvat. And they have 4 glasses of wine in their Seder. And what they would do is they would start, each of the glasses of wine have a different proportion of red wine to white wine. So the red wine is like summer, it's when everything is like fruit. And like winter is like white wine. And then you've got spring and fall in between. And the idea is it's supposed to represent the passing of the seasons. So, I'm just going to read. I really can't say this the way these people say it, so I'm just going to read it. Okay. So this is how it goes. The Torah says that God put Adam and Eve in the garden to work it and to guard it. The Jewish oral tradition teaches us that this refers to the do's and the don'ts of Torah. We've talked before about the do's are called the positive mitzvot and the don'ts are called the negative mitzvot. Adam and Eve were given very little to do. They were simply told, eat of all the trees of the garden. That was it, the first commandment. But don't, one single prohibition, was not to eat fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's it. So they could eat all of them. They had one don't. They messed it up, huh? Okay. The Torah teaches that God created I've read this before. While in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve's entire obligation was to enjoy all the lush fruits, with the notable exception of the one forbidden fruit. Sure enough, they went after that one. This misdeed demonstrated their confused orientation to the real meaning of pleasure. I mean, imagine being in the Garden of Eden, and you've never tasted fruits before, ever, in your whole life experience, and you're tasting all these amazing fruits, and you're having incredible pleasure because God gave us the nose and the taste buds, and He made them for our enjoyment, right? Mm-hmm. And they go, these taste all great. Why can't I have that one? What does that one taste like? Maybe it's the best of all. That's why we can't have it. I don't know what was in their head, but that's sort of how I think about it. That's not in here. That's just how I think about it. Okay, so they got confused about the real meaning of pleasure. The rabbis say that rather than seeing the fruits as pleasurable because they are God's gifts and enjoying them as part of their service or avodah to God, they wanted to partake of them independently of God. In fact, contrary to His will. So He says, I'm giving you this, and they go, no, I want that. They want the pleasure for the sake of pleasure. They want, what was that word again? I don't have it memorized. They had a lot. Yes. Le'ata. They wanted to le'ata. They wanted to eat for the sake of consuming, not according to God's will. So we can understand now that God's only desire in giving Adam and Eve those two mitzvot, eat this, don't eat that, was to give them the ultimate pleasure of bonding with Him. They would have to have a choice. You can do this and bond with me and be in service with me because you're doing it according to my will or not. True pleasure was not in the taste of the fruits, but in eating and enjoying the gifts from God. This was the way to serve and connect with Him. The ultimate pleasure is the bond we have with God because we know we are eating according to His good gifts. This is the root of all wrongdoing, when instead of seeing the pleasures of this world as a gift from God, enjoying them in the service of God, and using them as conduits to a connection to God, we seek pleasure independent of any connection to God. In other words, is the pleasure about us, or is the pleasure about our relationship with God? There is fundamental difference between having pleasure and receiving pleasure. I thought that was amazing. Let me say that again. There's a fundamental difference between having pleasure and receiving pleasure. If we want to have pleasure, it doesn't matter where it comes from. Having pleasure is void of any connection to a reality greater than ourselves. It is simply a selfish desire to experience a particular pleasure for its own sake. Receiving pleasure, on the other hand, is rooted in the soul's desire to serve God's purpose, which is to receive the ultimate joy of connecting to Him. Adam and Eve ate from the forbidden fruit because they were confused about their purpose on earth and consequently what is truly pleasurable in this world. They were clueless about what would bring them true meaning and joy in life. Following Adam and Eve's fatal mistake, God told them, because you ate from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from, the earth has become cursed. God was not punishing the earth because of Adam and Eve's transgression. Rather, He was informing them that their distorted orientation towards physical pleasures, taking them for themselves, has turned the earth into a source of curse rather than a blessing for them, for their descendants. It's the process of eating. How are we eating? Under whose command are we eating? Depending on how we view the physical world, it is cursed or blessed. If we look at the physical world as a conduit to a connection with God, and if as a service to God we gratefully receive his gift of delicious fruits, we thereby experience his presence and the physical world becomes blessed. The physical world then becomes a bridge between the human and the divine. But if we fixate on the physical, independent of any relationship with God, and mistakenly perceive this world as the source of our pleasure rather than as a bridge to God, then this world becomes a barrier to God and a curse for us. You guys liking Kabbalah? It's pretty deep, huh? It's pretty psychological. It's talking about what's going on in our minds and our hearts, right? The motivation of things. So
Sounds like idolatry.
yeah, in a sense, it is. It is. So there was this Rav, a Rebbe, way back then, because there's a lot of teachings about Tu B'Shvat. A lot of rabbis have different opinions about what was the fruit of the tree of knowledge versus the tree of life, and blah 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 blah. And some says that the tree of knowledge that we ate from was all the 7 species from Israel, and some says it was none of the 7 species. So they all have these different ideas. One opinion says it was a fig tree, another that was a grapevine, and so forth and so on. So it seems like when we sit down to eat the fruits on Tu B'Shvat, we're doing the same thing as Adam and Eve did. We're obeying the positive commandment while violating the negative one. So we're eating what we're not supposed to be eating, but anyway. So this rabbi comes along and he explains that the tree of knowledge was all of the 7 species and none of them at the same time. He explains that the tree of knowledge was not one species of fruit as opposed to another. It was not a thing at all, but it was a way of doing something, a way of eating. Whenever a person grabs pleasure from the world, he falls spiritually, and it's as if he is eating from the tree of knowledge. What does it mean to grab pleasure? It means to get so distracted by the pleasure of consumption that we forget about our Creator. We take the gift and leave the giver behind. When we eat the many fruits associated with the tree of knowledge on Tu B'Shvat and do so with the consciousness of our Creator, that is in itself is a rectification. It's a repair of what happened in the Garden of Eden. So basically, the we're seeing Tu B'Shvat is here we get to eat from the fruit again, but this time we get to do it in the right way, with blessing our Creator before we eat the fruit as a way of recognizing that this food is a way of connecting with Him. It is not a pleasure that's independent of Him. Isn't that kind of cool?
Yes.
So, I thought this was kind of a cool introduction to Kashrut because, well, it was new to me. I don't know if it was new to you, but it's kind of new to me because it seems to go deeper into this idea of eating. And it's really interesting because when we even talk, we've ever talked to Christians about the fact that you don't eat pork or you don't eat shellfish, right? They're like, what? How can you give that up? It's so good. It tastes so good. I was telling some of these ladies at lunch, I had kosher beef bacon at this kosher restaurant. Oh my Lord, it was so good. I haven't had bacon in so long. But it wasn't pork bacon. It was beef bacon. But it tasted just like the old stuff, right? There was a big tray of it, and it was on flatbread with caramelized onions and bacon. And it was a big plate of it.
Wow.
Beef, it's bacon made from a cow instead of bacon made from a pig.
Turkey bacon is just plain
Beef bacon.
Yeah, but turkey bacon's nothing compared to this stuff. This was really great. And we had a whole plate of bacon, but it was kosher bacon, right? And the meat was slaughtered according to God's commandments, and we gave thanks before we ate, and so it was kosher bacon right out of the Garden of Eden. Oh man, it was good. But, you ever talk to your Christian friends, they're like, how can you give that up? But they're referring to the physical pleasure of the food that has now become more important than God's commandment about the food. Right?
Well, they say that Yeshua did away with that.
Yeah, I know. But when it comes down to psychologically, they don't want to give it up. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But they don't want to change their lifestyle. They don't want to give up the pleasure. You know, what's really interesting is I used to love bacon. I used
I
to
did
love
too.
pork chops with applesauce. Oh man!
I love
But you know
bacon.
what? After we made the decision that we weren't going to do, I didn't
It
miss
was
it.
easy, actually.
Yeah.
So
It
it's
was.
been so long since I've had it. If I'm sitting on a table and people are eating it or
Grosses
even
you
like
out.
seafood, I can't look over there because it
Grosses
makes me
her.
nauseous.
Nauseous.
I'm
Wow.
Like, so weird because and it
Well,
don't
she
make-
told me actually, tell the truth, you think of cockroaches.
I was gonna say that, but yeah, I do.
It makes you feel like that, huh?
The shrimp and the lobster, you know, it's like cockroaches right on the inside.
No, I remember one time he gave a description of lobster. I don't know if you ever heard him describe it, that, like, think of it, when you eat lobster, it's like eating like a bag of pus. I'm like,
Wow.
that sounds terrible. That's
Florence, you
gross.
had a question or a
Well,
comment?
the pork, I mean, when they say it tastes really good, the bottom line is that the pork has those parasites in it. And
Yeah.
you want to eat parasites that can lodge in,
Right.
in your fingers, in your brain. I mean, I tell them, do you want that? You
Well,
know, so,
and
but
that's-
but like you said, they're not willing to
They
give it
don't
up,
listen.
even
They don't
though
listen.
they have parasites.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's unclean.
Yeah, they won't listen.
Right. So here's the thing. So a lot of people will say, well, you know, God gave that commandment because, and this is the Messianic circles. They say, well, God gave that commandment because we know that pork has the parasites and it's hard to cook it out and we can't store it and blah, 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 blah. And God knew that, so he was protecting us for health reasons. But now we can freeze the pork and we can do this and we can irradiate the pork and blah, 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 blah. So it's really all okay. Except that, as we're going to see in future sessions, the laws of Kashrut were given just because, with no rationale and no reason. They're the part of Torah that is given just because, with no justification whatsoever. Now, to me that was like, okay, God, I'm willing to do that because you said so. But when I was reading this, I got it in a different way. I got it that, you know, the very first commandment was eat this and not that. And we screwed it up.
Period.
Period. Eat this and not that. Why? Because if we eat it according to his commandment, it brings us a connection with him. If we eat contrary to his commandment, it brings death. Period. Period. That, to me, makes the laws of Kashrut way different. Way different. It's not, okay, I trust you, Father, to do this, but this case seems kind of silly. Or, you know, I don't understand it, I'm willing to do it, but, you know, gosh, I really wish I had the pork. This is this is different. This way of looking at it is so. Last night, past midnight, you know, I was doing my stuff after my Rev Shabbat meal, the last minute. But I'm reading this stuff, and you know, of course, there's no one around to tell. So I'm glad I haven't even told Mitchell yet. It's just so exciting. So. And here is this immense gift that he's given us, this gift of eating, and not just like that it tastes like sawdust, but amazing flavors and amazing pleasure. And he's given it to us. And all he said is you can eat all of this, but not that. It's a spiritual discipline. It's a spiritual moment of choice. It says, am I going to put myself in connection with the Creator or not with connection to the Creator? Okay? To me, that's huge. No one ever taught me that before. I don't know. Probably all the Jewish people know about that, but I didn't know about that before. And so this Kabbalistic way of looking at Tu B'Shvat just really, I thought, wow, what a great, because I didn't want to teach about Kashrut. I'm sorry, I didn't. It's like controversial. I'm going, oh my God, everybody's going to hate me. But here's this introduction. This is the foundation for Kashrut. He said you can eat all this, just not that. Because he wants to have a relationship with us. Right. Isn't that cool? Mm-hmm. So in the next little while, we're going to talk some more about Kashrut. But the conclusion of this is, I just want to read this little bit. It says, unlike Adam and Eve, who sought pleasure separate from God and who turned physical pleasure into a barrier to God, we on Tu B'Shvat enjoy the fruits as God's gifts and experience their pleasure as a connection to God. In this, we rectify the transgression of Adam and Eve. And how do we do that? How do we make it spiritual? By saying a blessing. and this is my conclusion, that eating is not just a way of rectifying the original sin on Tu B'Shvat. That when we bless our food and we eat this and not that every single day of every single month, we are making eating a mitzvah. We are raising our souls to God all the time. And we are rectifying that original sin every time we sit down to a meal. Isn't that kind of cool? Yay, God. So I'm going to go back to the quote of Tree of Life, and I want us to turn to Etz Chaim Hi. I want us to just sing that together before we go. Because I said I would come back to it, and here's the deal.
Can you
Rectifying ourselves to God, and what else did you say?
Sorry, let me say it again. The very last thing. Unlike Adam and Eve, who sought pleasure separate from God and who turned physical pleasure into a barrier to God, we on Tu B'Shvat enjoy the fruits as God's gift and experience their pleasure as a connection to God. In this way, we rectify the transgression of Adam and Eve. We rectify. We repair. Tikkun. Cosmic repair. You are repairing the universe when you sit down to a meal and you eat this and not that.
Yes.
And you bless it before, so or after, whichever you want to do. But you put it in the context of God's gift to you. You are repairing the universe.
Right.
That's the Kabbalistic view of Kashrut.
There's a verse in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 6. It says, "And having in readiness to revenge all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled." It's saying exactly what you're
very
saying.
cool. So our obedience to Torah rectifies the
It's a revenge to all disobedience.
It's a revenge to all. Oh, I like that.
What's
Revenge.
that?
It's a revenge to all.
2 Corinthians 10:6.
2 Corinthians 10:6. Say that loud for the tape.
Okay, 2 Corinthians 10:6. Okay. Want to read it?
Go ahead.
It says, "And having in readiness to revenge all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled."
So cool. I love that. That's what I was going to start doing, is start to bring some New Testament in next time. Brit Hadashah. Thank you, Susie. So the tree of life is the wisdom of Torah. And the wisdom of Torah says that every time we sit down to eat, we rectify original sin. We're able to heal the world. Tikkun Olam. That's what Tu B'Shvat is about. It's about Tikkun Olam, healing the world. And of course, there's a lot of talk about the tree of life on this holiday, and that's why I thought it would be important for us to, it would be cool for us to just sing Etz Chaim Hi. It's on page 156. And of course, the reference verse for this is the same as we had at the beginning of our handout, which was the fruit of the righteousness is a tree of life. Whoever captures souls as wives. It is a tree of life to those who take hold of it, and whoever grasps it close will be made happy. Proverbs 3:18. The Torah shows us how to repair the world. Etz Chaim Hi Lamahazikim Ba Betom Teya Meushar Darkei Noam V'kol Netivoteya Shalom Hashivenu Adonai Elecha Benashuva Hadesh Yameinu Hadesh Yameinu Kekedem. Amen.
Amen.